For this sample, you need 2 rectangles of fabric. For the inward curve, you will put your pieces of fabric right sides together and trim an inward curve along the edge, and then you will pin that edge together. And here we're going to sew the inside curve. Again, I'm lining up my curve on the 1.5. I'm making sure my needle is over the fabric. I'm going to start by going forward 3 or 4 stitches, backwards, and now I'm going to follow the inward curve. And again with this one, if I'm having trouble keeping my fabric going along that curve, you can lower your foot, or lower your needle, sorry, and raise your presser foot and pivot so that you can always keep the edge of the fabric lined up with that 1.5. And again, turn the balance wheel towards you, lower the needle, raise the presser foot, and you can turn your fabric as much as you need to keep lined up. And again with this, it's a fairly gentle curve. I'm able to simply manipulate the fabric and make it go the way I want it. And then as I get to the end, I'm going to reverse and go forward to lock my stitching. Pull it out, snip your threads, same on the opposite side, and there is your inward curves. So this would be a curve that you might see on a scooped neckline, for example. But also sometimes on, if you're doing craft projects on stuffed animals, there will be a whole variety of lines and curves to sew. On the inward curve, when you're finished sewing, again, you're going to do some trimming. So we are going to start by trimming. So we are going to cut off approximately half of the seam between the seam and the edge of the fabric. And this is called the seam allowance that we are cutting. And then I'm going to grade the seam. So when I grade it, I'm going to cut 1 layer shorter than the other. And I'm just going to pick this up. I find it a little easier to do if I'm holding it. It's a little tricky getting your shears in there, but if you take your time. If you're hurrying, sometimes you end up making mistakes. So now again, we have 1 seam shorter than the other, and then we are going to clip this seam. Now the word clip is used quite often in sewing. If you clip a corner, you cut off a diagonal piece of fabric. In this one, when we clip, we are doing straight cuts. It's similar to doing an inside corner. And I'm cutting close to my stitching, but again, you do not want to cut your stitching. And this is a pretty gentle curve. I'm probably doing more clips than I need to along here, but I'm doing them approximately every 1.5 centimeters is what they look like. I probably could have done them every 2 centimeters. But again, with this, when we turn it, it needs to stretch a bit in order to lie smoothly. And so by doing that clipping, it's going to allow it to stretch, and the trimming and the grading is going to reduce the bulk and give a nicer look to the edge on the garment. So that is the inward curve. So trimmed and graded and clipped, and we're now ready to do understitching. And I actually trimmed part of this so that one side is shorter than the other. So I'm going to call this the facing, and this would be the main body of whatever it is. So this is something I would do if I was doing a scooped or a rounded neckline on a garment. And so you would take the facing piece and you pull it up so that it is over top of the seam allowance underneath it here. You can press this if you want. I usually just move it as I sew, but you can press it too. Now I'm going to be stitching on the facing and through onto the seam allowances below the facing. And what this is going to do is it's going to help this edge float to the back and not show. Facings have a tendency to want to flip upwards, and this set of stitching is going to help it roll to the back without that happening, and it will stay in place without needing to do another set of stitching on top. Now another way to do it would be to top stitch. So this is something you wouldn't have to understitch, but I often understitch even if I top stitch because it will hold it in place better. So now I'm going to be sewing about 3 millimeters away. So I'm actually placing my needle in the fabric so I can see exactly where I'm starting. because I want to sew very close to the edge of this original seam. If you're too far away, this does not do the job it's supposed to do. Now, stitching is like anything else. Forward, backward, forward. You want to lock your stitching. And then I'm going to sew a few stitches, but I'm watching as I go because I am following a curve. So I have to make sure as I go, like I can't sew over down here. I'd sew a funny crease in this. It has to keep moving as I go around this curve. And I could stop and use the pivot. If I felt like I was getting crooked, I could lower my needle and pivot and move it that way. But again, this is a fairly gentle curve. I can manipulate the fabric, but I am stopping periodically and just making sure that that facing piece, that shorter piece, is pulled tight so that I'm not, so that it's sewing nice and straight and even, and an even distance from the edge. And then when I get to the end, I'm going to backstitch, and as always, trim my threads close to the fabric on both sides. And so if I just hold it like this, that's what you're looking at, but this shorter part is the facing edge, and I'm going to be pressing this. And you can see already it's pulling to the back. It's going to hide completely. You're not going to see an edge poking up there. So that is how you understitch. So you see the stitching on the underside, but you do not see the stitching on the top of the fabric. When you finished your understitching, you want to go to the ironing board and press this. So I'm going to start on the wrong side. And you can see again, I hadn't even pressed that previously, and it was already sitting nicely on the wrong side. And then from the right side, and we have a nice smooth edge, and none of that back side, the facing piece, is showing on the right side. And that is your completed understitched sample.